Late at night, you and your colleague are working on a platform above an open, active incinerator when suddenly they fall. They scream as their body becomes engulfed in the flames. You look down at them, helpless, as they writhe in pain. Neither you nor your colleague can shut off the incinerator or get them out. They will now certainly die an agonizing death over the next few minutes. Next to you happens to be a table with two weapons, a loaded handgun and a tranquilizer dart. Shooting a bullet will kill your colleague immediately, whereas shooting the tranquilizer dart might ease their suffering, although you cannot be completely sure it will. What do you do? Do you shoot the gun? Do you shoot the tranquilizer dart? Or do you walk away? This is a thought experiment, and I encourage you to share your thoughts about that experiment in the comments section below. It's not necessarily a realistic scenario of what could or will happen, but it's designed to get you thinking about the ethics of euthanasia, dying, death. In this video, I want to discuss the ethics of euthanasia of children and infants. But before doing so, I want to talk about euthanasia in adults. And to start with, I'd like to start with a case from my home country, Australia. If I were to keep a pet animal in the same condition I am in, I would be prosecuted. If you disagree with voluntary euthanasia, then don't use it, but don't deny the right to me to use it. Those were some of the last words of Robert Dent, a Northern Territorian who was the first person in the world to be euthanized by a statute law. He suffered a long battle with prostate cancer and passed away in September 1996. Mr. Dent's decision to request euthanasia came after 5 years of battling prostate cancer, which in his final months he described as a roller coaster of pain made worse by the unwanted side effects of the palliative drugs. He endured countless surgeries and treatments designed to rid his body of the cancer, but none of them worked, and his condition became terminal. Any future treatment would have to be experimental and risky. Such treatments would likely also be futile. They wouldn't likely improve his condition or his chances of survival, and they would prolong his suffering. His debilitating illness left him to ask and request for the only thing that he felt could, in his view, relieve him of his symptoms of pain and suffering. That was euthanasia. In September 1996, a combination of barbiturates and muscle relaxants, controlled by a computerized syringe under Mr. Dent's control, affected his peaceful death. Before this, a long process had been undertaken to confirm his physical condition, his mental state, and his ability to make the decision autonomously for himself. A physician specializing in his condition was brought on to consult and confirm the prognosis and diagnosis. A leading psychiatrist from Sydney was flown in to analyze his mental state, and through a cooling off period and multiple requests for euthanasia, Mr. Dent's decision was decided to be genuine and not in any way forced. It was an autonomous decision of his own. Throughout this entire process, Mr. Dent's personal physician guided him through the process and ultimately was the one that set up the computerized syringe for Mr. Dent to operate. It probably could not be said then that Mr. Dent lacked information about his medical condition or his prognosis, or that he lacked mental competence to make the decision that he did. Nor could we say really that he made a decision that wasn't his own decision. It was an autonomous decision. And also the alternative medical options available to Mr. Dent, in his view, were insufficient to alleviate his suffering. But still, not all people will agree with his decision. Some would appeal to human rights. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, adopted by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Article 6.1, states that every human being has the inherent right to life. This right shall be protected by law. No one should be arbitrarily deprived of their life. I recently interviewed Bernadette Tobin, a bioethicist and philosopher from the Australian Catholic University. She believes that deliberately killing is wrong, and that it violates our humanity and our quality as humans. In our interview, she quoted a conclusion reached by an English House of Lords committee, which solidifies this view.
So this is 1994, this is back in the Middle Ages.
Okay.
A select committee of the English House of Lords unanimously rejected the legalisation of euthanasia, and it put its rejection this way: society's prohibition of intentional killing is the cornerstone of law and social relationships. It protects each of us impartially, embodying the belief that we are all equal. We don't wish that protection to be diminished, and we therefore recommend there should be no change in the law to permit euthanasia. So it raises the question, equal in what respect? And what I think they mean is in the respect of our humanity, our capacity to live the life, not of a carrot, not of a cat, but of a human being. Reason and will are not simply add-ons to mere animal capacities. They qualify and they transform those capacities, making human experience what it is. So it's a capacity for human awareness, feelings, imagination, memory, responsiveness, sexuality, wondering, relating, imagining, communicating, deliberating, choosing, acting. It's all of that. We are equal with respect to all of that, our common humanity.
I encourage you to watch the full video of the interview I had with Bernadette. A link to it is in the description below. Linking this back to the case of Mr. Dent, it seems that he did deliberately kill himself, and the state in fact facilitated and supported that deliberate killing. And if we accept some of what's just been said, then we might be worried about Mr. Dent's human rights, our rights as citizens, the equality of rights given to citizens in the state, and also our common humanity. One argument is that Mr. Dent's death violated his inherent human right to life. But critics of this view might ask, well, what do we mean by a right to life? Are we ignoring an important essence of what we mean by human? Belonging to a particular species, Homo sapiens, doesn't necessarily bring moral claims or rights. Peter Singer, a famous Australian philosopher, popularised the term speciesism in his 1975 book on animal liberation. Racists violate the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of their own race when there is a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. Sexists violate the principle of equality by favouring the interests of their own sex. Similarly, speciesists allow the interests of their own species to override the greater interests of the members of other species. The pattern is identical in each case. It was through this and other arguments that Singer advocated for us to consider the capacities of humans and non-human animals, and the interests which arise from those capacities. For example, it is wrong for a human to eat meat if its justification is that you're putting the interests of the human above that of the non-human animal merely because the human is a human and the animal is a non-human animal. As English philosopher Jeremy Bentham aptly put it, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? So maybe it is reasonable to analyse the underlying capacities and the interests which arise from those capacities, rather than just membership to the human species. For example, in English, we have the word or phrase brain dead, and this refers to someone who is technically in some sense dead in their brain. Their brain is not functioning, they have neurological malfunction or just no activity in their brain, but their body is mostly alive. For example, their liver still functions, their kidneys still work, but their brain doesn't work. And when this damage is so severe and permanent, we sometimes call these people brain dead. And when people make this kind of judgment, they're making a judgment about the capacity of that person, or lack of person, some might say. For example, do they have the capacity or abilities to communicate, to reason, to think, to understand their surroundings, to experience pleasure and pain, to experience imagination, goodness, all of these things. But more on these distinctions about capacities and persons and humans a bit later. For now, I just want to identify that there is this thing, a capacity argument, to be made. And based on that argument, it seems that it's truer to say that every person, rather than every human being, is deserving of human rights and a right to life. But Mr. Dent was not brain dead. He was clearly a human, a fully functioning, had capacity sort of human. So you might wonder, why did the Australian Human Rights Commission find that Mr. Dent's decision did not violate his or anyone else's human rights? Mainly it was for two reasons. Reason number one, the legislation had limited scope. It was only directed towards people with a terminal illness and who wanted to die, and therefore life was not being deprived in an arbitrary fashion. It was very purposeful and directed and limited. And the second was exactly about this limiting factor, Even though the state was complicit in the killing of one individual, it was not failing to protect other individuals who did not want to die. Nevertheless, we might still worry that those protections or safeguards are insufficient, and I'll come to this in a moment. But first, I would like to just briefly outline my own position. My view is, even if we don't accept the finding that euthanasia laws can avoid violating a human right to life, we cannot say to have established a meaningful right to life without giving individuals a right to control their life, including how it ends. Can a right to life be meaningful if one cannot exercise that right in ways which make it, in the full sense, a life? Said differently, what good is a life you don't have power over, or one in which you suffer unbearably, hopelessly, and without any or much enjoyment? These might fall under the literal definition of a life, but to say that they all, irrespective of their features, have the same quality is to deny the factual differences. To further say that individuals must accept what others ascribe to them as the values which constitute a life, or, as is sometimes said, a life worth living, is to say that you know how to live someone's life better than they do. How can we reason this for a fully mature, capable adult of sound mind like Mr. Dent? I personally don't think that we can, and it's for these same reasons I think euthanasia in cases like Mr. Dent's does not risk damaging the equality of citizens and the state's care for them, or indeed our common humanity. In fact, I feel almost oppositely. I feel that offering people like Mr. Dent an option to control his death promotes equality and our common humanity. Doing anything less feels to me like we as a society are imposing unusual cruelty on these individuals and forcing them to needlessly endure tremendous and needless personal suffering. Some who oppose legalizing euthanasia will actually agree with what I just said, but their disagreement comes in the form of a slippery slope argument. Such people might say something like, well, we might start with good practice, good legislation, but we will slowly slip in to bad practice, to immoral cases. And indeed, this should be a concern for any society wishing to legislate on these kind of issues. But it goes both ways. We don't want to needlessly prolong life, nor do we want to needlessly hasten death. We ultimately don't want people to needlessly suffer. So what are the right laws and regulations to avoid slippage in either direction? Well, actually, this is rather an empirical question. There have been many jurisdictions now which have legalized euthanasia with particular regulations in place, and we can go back and look at were those regulations enough to avoid some of the things we're worried about. However, on a topic as controversial as this, it's unsurprising that we can find different interpretations of the same data. However, I find that all interpretations admit two things. First, that we can't eliminate 100% of the risk. That's just not possible. And second, we can eliminate some of the risk by having particular safeguards or regulations in place. Indeed, probably agree that there are some level of safeguards and regulations in place, even in jurisdictions which currently make euthanasia illegal. The safeguards and regulations in place are preventing cases of euthanasia. As it happens in such jurisdictions, many doctors claim that euthanasia actually does happen, it just happens illegally or out of sight. So if we're worried about a slippery slope, it might be fair to say that we should be more worried about the current system where euthanasia is illegal rather than making a system which is more transparent. In the case of euthanasia laws, safeguards include things like psychiatric treatment and assessment, confirming the diagnosis and prognosis with other doctors, consulting the patient, family, and ensuring that the decision is sustained over time, it isn't sort of whimsical. And all of these safeguards are meant to ultimately protect the patient against not only themselves, but against unscrupulous doctors or family members and so on. And after we have in place all of those safeguards, we then have to ask, is the remaining risk worth the benefits that we get? Now, clearly the primary benefit is to the patient themselves. They're being relieved of their suffering, and that is the thing we should focus on. However, I do think there are benefits to others, like the patient's family. There's an Australian television program called Gruen, which critiques advertising. And in one of the segments, they ask advertisers to sell the unsellable. In one such segment, they asked advertisers to convince Australians that euthanasia should be mandatory by the age of 80. Here was one of the adverts.
I never met my granny because she lived very far away.
I'd pick up the phone and I'd say, sorry, I miss my dad.
I would have made more time somehow. She always had these stories, and now they've died with her.
When my bapu, Grandpa, died, I wanted to celebrate his life. Then I realised I didn't know enough about him.
We can't help you make up for lost time. But if you knew your loved one's time was almost up, would it help you find time?
Let's all go by 80.
So we make every minute count.
Australasia for Euthanasia. Let's all go by 80.
Now, for the record, I don't at all agree with or accept any sort of mandatory euthanasia law, and that's not something that I want to advocate for at all. But I do think that that advert makes a strong emotional point about the other sorts of benefits that euthanasia can bring. Now that we've discussed a little bit about euthanasia in the case of adults, I'd now like to talk about children. During the 1995 parliamentary debate of the law which Mr. Dent would eventually use to end his life, a member of Parliament said the following: "This proposed legislation provides that something can be done provided that the person is over 18 years of age. However, if it were my 9-year-old stepdaughter who had happened to be in that circumstance, it would be okay for me to watch her continue to suffer. The legislation has no provision for children. Is it easier to watch a child dying in agony than an adult? Will we deal with children? What happens when a child is dying in agony? Do we ignore them too? Why is it right for a mentally competent adult, but not right for anybody else? Interestingly, a 17-year-old cannot make a choice to be euthanized, but an 18-year-old can." Belgium amended its euthanasia laws in 2014 to allow children access to euthanasia, and since then, an average of about 1 case per year has been reported. However, this does not make euthanasia in the case of children a minor issue. If we believe adults deserve access to euthanasia, then we should allow it for children if their circumstances are comparable. The main and salient concern often is, how can we know what the child wants? And also, how can we know that they have the capacity, when they say that they want something or don't want something, how can we know they have the capacity to really know the impact behind what they're saying and what they're expressing? As implied during the parliamentary debate in Australia, there isn't a magical overnight creation of capacity in an 18-year-old human when just a day before they legally didn't have recognition of those capacities. Indeed, autonomy and the capacity to make decisions is a gradual and ongoing process which we as humans develop over our life. And this sort of bears out in our practices of parenting, for example. We might think that it's not appropriate for a 4-year-old to be sent to school alone, whereas if that child was 14 years old, maybe we wouldn't have as much of a problem with it. And likewise, if a child doesn't understand the concepts of death or dying, we wouldn't probably accept that they can make a decision about death or dying. To grant euthanasia access to children in Belgium in the 2014 law, there was a focus on what was called a capacity for discernment, and this was influenced by definitions from the Swiss Federal Court and the Canadian Supreme Court. The Belgian Constitutional Court ruled that the term capacity for discernment relates to the ability of the minor to understand the real implications of their euthanasia request and its consequences, and that it is inherent in the criterion used that a minor's capacity for discernment must be assessed case by case, taking into account all of the circumstances that determine their situation, medical condition, age, maturity, etc. Even given all this, it could be that we still have some intuitive hesitation about ascribing to children a capacity for understanding death or dying or the choice of euthanasia. We tend to look at children as innocent, naive, and therefore in need of our protection. Empirically, however, we find that children, by around the age of 7 in most cases, understand some key conceptual features of death and dying. For example, universality, that we all die, non-functionality, which is that we cease to function as ourselves when we die, and causality, that things like disease or accidents cause us to die. And a constellation of understanding of all of these features is unlikely to come all at once. It's possible that a child might understand universality but not causality. And although more empirical evidence is needed, it has been shown that children with terminal illnesses or who have some experience of death and dying, say through family members or friends, actually have more advanced conceptions of death than children that don't have those experiences. And that sort of makes sense. In the context of funerals or hospitals, it's understandable that a child will learn things like causality or universality or non-functionality. So it's possible, with the right medical team, with the right psychological support and legal protections in place to monitor all of that, it might be possible that a child could understand their choice of euthanasia, understand and have good conceptions of death, and be evaluated as such, and then be given access to euthanasia. And as I mentioned in the case of Belgium, this has happened a handful of times since 2014. However, we have another problem that starts to arise. What happens for children that don't have this full capacity to understand their decision, or understand that there is even a decision to be made? For example, what about infants? Should their lack of capacity mean that we refrain from making choices about their medical treatment? Or if we shouldn't refrain, who should make the choices? I recently interviewed Edward Verhagen, a pediatrician specializing in palliative care in pediatrics. He works in the University Medical Center in Groningen in the Netherlands. He believes that if a child is suffering and lacks the capacity to make a decision about their own medical treatment, that the parents are the ones that should step in consultation with doctors and others, to help make a decision. In our interview, he explained it like this.
Suffering is something that we should try to prevent because it ruins lives. And I don't believe suffering has a purpose. So even before birth, if there's clear suffering, I think there is a task for us to limit it or end it. And then to me, the most important element is who decides about that. And is it society that decides how we approach this individual? Or is it the individual itself? Yes, but not when the individual is too young, because there is no way to do that. So to me, the role of the parents is very, very clear. They are the ones that are responsible for guiding the child in every way in the first years of life and help the child develop to a human being. They guard the child, they guard that person that they love from even before birth. And they should be allowed to have a huge say in what others do to the child or don't do to the child. So I feel that there is a person in the crib, and I see that parents are the best people to guard that person, and irrespective of the disease.
I encourage you to watch the full interview I had with Edward. You'll find a link in this video's description. When we're talking about children who can't speak for themselves, we're often talking about infants. Edward has a unique experience of this difficult topic, as reported in a German news program.
Falls Karin, Edwin und Sam Hindricks aus dem niederländischen Emmen wie eine unbeschwerte Familie erscheinen, dann täuscht das. Das Schicksal von Bente, der älteren Tochter, lastet auf den Hindricks. Das Mädchen lebte nur 8,5 Monate. Von Geburt an litt es unter einer extremen Fehlbildung der Haut. Diese löste sich bei jeder direkten Berührung vom Körper ab. Das Leiden war so unerträglich, dass die Eltern schließlich Ärzte um Sterbehilfe baten. Eine solche Entscheidung kann man nur aus Liebe treffen, sagt er. Und sie fügt hinzu, alle Eltern wollen das Beste für ihr Kind. Alle Eltern. So etwas macht man nur, weil man sein Kind so unendlich liebt. Keine Mutter kann es aushalten, sein Kind permanent leiden zu sehen. Das ist schlimmer als die Trauer, die wir nun empfinden, wo sie nicht mehr da ist. Dies ist der Arzt, den die Eltern vor 4 Jahren um Hilfe anflehten. Eduard Verhagen, Chefarzt der Universitätskinderklinik in Groningen, sah damals keine andere Möglichkeit als abzulehnen, sonst hätte er eine Anklage wegen Mordes riskiert. Doch nun führt er einen ebenso erbitterten wie höchst umstrittenen Kampf darum, dass Neugeborenen Sterbehilfe gewährt werden darf. Die Frage ist, was tun wir? Sollen wir warten, bis die Natur die Dinge richtet? Sollen wir die Babys ruhig stellen, bis sie sterben? Oder sollen wir die Verantwortung übernehmen und ihr Leben aktiv beenden? In krassen Ausnahmefällen, davon ist der Mediziner überzeugt, hat ein Arzt sogar die Pflicht, Leiden von Säuglingen zu lindern, indem er Sterbehilfe leistet. Konservative Politiker wie Bas van der Vlies laufen dagegen Sturm. Gerade das Leben von Kindern müsse besonders geschützt werden. Ich nehme es bestimmt nicht leicht, wenn ein Kind so krank ist. Das kann sicherlich bedrückend sein. Aber es liegt nicht in unseren Händen, das Leben zu beenden. Das ist für mich keine Option. In der Realität allerdings passiert es längst, dass niederländische Babys Sterbehilfe bekommen. Nach Schätzungen mindestens 15 Mal pro Jahr. Aber nur in einem Fünftel dieser Fälle wird der Tod aktenkundig. Da das Tabuthema nun ans Licht gebracht wird, regt sich auch in Medizinerkreisen Widerspruch. Ist es wirklich notwendig? Können wir nichts anderes tun? Ist Sterbehilfe das Einzige, was uns bleibt? Ich glaube, wir haben da noch andere Möglichkeiten, diesen Kindern zu helfen. Eduard Verhagen, dem seine Gegner Gewissenlosigkeit vorwerfen, will nicht als Dr. Tod gesehen werden. Ihm geht es darum, bei hoffnungslosem Siechtum Leiden zu ersparen und diese Dinge an die Öffentlichkeit zu bringen, so wie es die Eltern von Bente getan haben, nach monatelangem Leidensweg. Bei ihrer Geburt hatte unsere Tochter noch 10 Zehen. Nach 5 Monaten haben sie angefangen zusammenzuwachsen. Der Fuß war nur noch ein Klumpen. Ihr Zustand wurde immer schlimmer und es war schmerzvoll, sie anzusehen. Ihre Tochter ist schließlich in der Obhut des Hausarztes gestorben. Was bleibt, ist ihre tiefe Überzeugung, dass der Tod manchmal humaner sein kann, als das Leben fortzusetzen.
It was around this time that Edward and his team developed what's been known as the Groningen Protocol. This was a protocol which consolidated legal, ethical and medical perspectives into one consolidating document to guide end-of-life decision-making in the case of newborns. The protocol lists 5 requirements which must be met for euthanasia in severely ill newborns. 1. The diagnosis and prognosis must be certain. 2. Hopeless and unbearable suffering must be present. 3. The diagnosis, prognosis, and unbearable suffering must be confirmed by at least one independent doctor. 4. Both parents must give informed consent. 5. The procedure must be performed in accordance with the accepted medical standard. While fulfilling these requirements, information is needed to support and clarify the decision about euthanasia, and actions from the stage of diagnosis and prognosis to after death are prescribed. The initial public perception of this protocol was quite controversial, but at least in the Netherlands has become less and less controversial over time. Part of the initial controversy and concern was about a potential slippery slope arising, but as Edward explained in our interview, such a slope hasn't really been evidenced.
So interestingly, one of the elements that was feared most from our regulation, from our protocol, was what people call the slippery slope. Once you start doing this in the toughest cases, you'll see that soon you'll be ending the lives of so many babies for less good reasons. And so we were happy with the survey system because we could clearly demonstrate that after legalization of newborn euthanasia, the cases did not go up, they went down. And so that helps. It helped. The obsession of the Dutch in this particular area helps us to be able to monitor how newborns die and know exactly what is changing and then focus on the change and try to find out why is it changing.
So, if no slippery slope has eventuated, should we accept this protocol? I personally think so. If euthanasia should be offered to adults, I think it should be offered to children as well, even if they lack capacities to make choices about euthanasia itself. Others can and do step in to make those sorts of decisions. Of course, those should be very rare and extreme cases, and I certainly think there should be a wide array of safeguards that we put in place to monitor those sorts of situations. But where similar protocols are absent, we might be slipping into a different sort of slippery slope, one which prolongs life needlessly, prolongs suffering needlessly. So we should be careful and guard against that, as well as guarding against needlessly hastening death. The other thing that I think is very important to acknowledge is that these are extremely difficult decisions, and ones which are extremely difficult to judge from the outside. They are personal, traumatic, and harrowing experiences which I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And I therefore think that we ought to reserve our judgment as much as possible and approach these things with compassion and understanding and sensitivity. Although I in no way want to equate abortion with infanticide or the killing of newborns, I do think that a very important and interesting article was published in 2013 titled "Afterbirth Abortion: Why Should the Baby Live?" This article is of course very controversial. The authors argue that post-birth abortion, that is, killing of a newborn, should be permissible if abortion of a fetus with equivalent reasons is also permissible. The argument supporting this can be broken down into three parts. Part 1, both fetuses and newborns are potential persons, not actual persons. Because of this, they can't be subject to the same sort of moral right to life as an actual person. As potential persons and not actual persons, it's therefore not possible to deprive them of a moral right to life because they aren't an actual person yet. To say that they are deprived of something would be to say that they have something to begin with, and if they don't have a capacity for understanding that they have a life, that they have a value intrinsic to themselves of wanting to continue that life, then it's difficult to say that they're being deprived of their potentiality as an actual person in the future. Nevertheless, the authors admit that under the right circumstances, these potential persons, fetuses and newborns, do become actual persons. But that doesn't matter because at the moment that we are ending their life, they are not actual persons and they're not being deprived of something. Part 2 focuses on this point of potential persons not being harmed by their death. This, the authors argue, essentially makes their moral worth irrelevant. As the authors state, if a potential person, like a fetus or a newborn, does not become an actual person, like you and us, then there is neither an actual nor a future person who can be harmed, which means that there is no harm at all. So, if you ask one of us if we would have been harmed had our parents decided to kill us when we were fetuses or newborns, our answer is no, because they would have harmed someone who does not exist, the us, whom you are asking the question, which means no one. And if no one is harmed, then no harm has occurred. Part 3. Some may say that, okay, even accepting that, shouldn't we just let the newborns or the fetuses who are preterm be adopted? But the authors don't acknowledge that adoption is always good for actual persons, as they describe. Birth mothers are reported to experience serious psychological problems due to their inability to elaborate their loss and to cope with their grief. It is true that grief and sense of loss may accompany both abortion and afterbirth abortion, as well as adoption, but we cannot assume that for the birth mother the latter is the least traumatic. We are not suggesting that these are definitive reasons against adoption as a valid alternative to afterbirth abortion. Much depends on circumstances and psychological reactions. What we are suggesting is that if interests of actual persons should prevail, then afterbirth abortion should be considered a permissible option for women who would be damaged by giving up their newborns for adoption. To me, this article doesn't necessarily highlight an outline for a perfect policy that we should go ahead and enact tomorrow, but rather it highlights some important moral features and points to be made. I think quite predominantly it raises the point of what are the right bases on which we can fundamentally say that abortion, for example, is moral. For example, in many people's reactions, it seems that the same reasons pre-birth are not possible post-birth. For example, economic reasons. Why is that? I also think this article does well to highlight the continuous evolving nature of capacity of humans. And it also helps us discern and feel for ourselves what do those capacities mean morally, legally, and so on. The unfortunate reality of medical care for mothers, newborns, and fetuses is messy, complicated, and often extremely sad in these cases that we're talking about, in the case of, say, severely disabled newborns or abortion due to health reasons. And I personally think that we should continue to research and find better technologies to support healthy fetuses, newborns, mothers. But on this point, I wanted to highlight a proposed bill by a retiring Conservative politician in Australia. He described it like this.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, last night I watched and heard the testimony of a midwife who was present at the a live birth following an abortion. and she was asked to actually photograph the child for the hospital records or the medical clinic's records, and in taking the photograph the child actually started breathing. And the child started breathing and continued to live for several hours, and that child died without any medical intervention. And this happens in hospitals and abortion clinics across this country on more of a regular basis than we would like to think, and what the abortionists like to admit, because one of them in recent times has said that this is a rare occurrence. It is not a rare occurrence. I had the Parliamentary Library do a bit of research on this topic, looking into the commonality of abortions where there is a live birth. And what they found is that in Victoria, according to the Mothers, Babies and Children publication, there are a total of 1,626 late-term abortions in Victoria that resulted in 198 live births between 2012 and 2016. That's over 12% of those late-term abortions that resulted in live births. And there does not appear to be any medical intervention as a result of those births. In Queensland, an ABC report stated there were 204 terminations with live birth outcomes between 2005 and 2015. And in fact, in Queensland, the Queensland Health clinical guidelines for medical termination of pregnancy actually state if a live birth occurs, do not provide life-sustaining treatment, for example, gastric tubes, IV lines and oxygen therapy. Document date and time end of life occurs. In other words, leave the baby to die. In WA, there were 27 cases as at 19th of May 2017, 27 cases of abortion that resulted in a live birth that were reported between July 1999 and December 2016. Of these, 21 were at 20 weeks gestation or later. There is no record of medical intervention or resuscitation in these cases. In South Australia, while abortion's been liberalised very recently, thanks to the work of people like Jodie Pickard and Love Adelaide, and also the work of Senator Antic, who's in the chamber here listening to my speech, there have been provisions put into new laws that actually make it a legal obligation that medical care be given to babies born alive during abortions. And we don't know the full picture. These stats that I quoted in other states are not the full picture, and there certainly is no data out of Tasmania, Northern Territory or ACT. Also, New South Wales does not publish statistics. Now, we have an external affairs power in our Constitution, and we also have international obligations under the International Convention of the Rights of the Child. And in that International Convention, which we have signed up to, it states in Article 6 that state parties, which includes Australia, recognise that every child has the inherent right to life, and that state parties, again including Australia, shall ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of the child. Further, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provides that every human being has the inherent right to life. The right to life shall be protected by law, and no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his life.
Sounds pretty clear to me.
So that is clear. We are in breach in this country of our international obligations. And as a result, I have had the Parliamentary Council actually draft for me a bill. It is the Human Rights Children Born Alive Protection Bill. This bill seeks to make it mandatory in all states and territories for all corporations that are involved in medical termination of pregnancies or abortions to actually provide medical life-saving treatment when a child is born alive as a result of an abortion. Whatever your view on abortion, there is no argument that a child that is out of the womb, that is at 22 weeks or more and has a chance of living, we know this from babies that are born very, very early, that there should be no argument against providing a child life-saving treatment in these circumstances. So I've written to the Prime Minister, the Health Minister, the Attorney General, the Deputy Prime Minister, asked them to consider making this bill a government bill, or at least allowing it as a private member's bill to go to a vote on the floor of Parliament. This should be the most serious issue before this Parliament, because it's a life and death issue. Young babies are dying across this country and it needs to stop.
The bill proposes that doctors involved in such procedures should be fined $500,000 if they don't provide life-saving or life-sustaining treatment to the newborn. And indeed it can and does happen that during abortion procedures that the baby, the fetus, the newborn is born with some signs of life. It's also important to say that this is very rare and very traumatic and personal for everyone involved. But I also think it's extremely important to recognize that we're making a huge philosophical and moral jump when we start labeling things as a fetus or as a newborn or as an infant and so on. In fact, although there's a discrete event, clearly, where the fetus is separated from the mother and becomes a newborn, actually its capacities aren't that much changed. We could even say that the capacities are reduced. So while there's a large change in the environment surrounding the newborn or the fetus, there actually isn't a strong, discrete change in its capacities. And yet we have completely different words and ascribe completely different concepts potentially and capacities potentially along with these different words. In practice, a newborn in this circumstance essentially has almost no capacity to continue living on their own and in most cases is left to die. And most doctors involved in procedures like this say that it's unethical to attempt to resuscitate or sustain the life of a newborn in this case. Going back to the thought experiment I posed at the beginning of the video, I personally find that no one could defend not at least shooting the tranquilizer dart. And if the tranquilizer dart doesn't seem to work, I think we're morally obliged to use the gun with bullets. The problem for me is, how can we know that the tranquilizer dart actually worked in these circumstances? Now, I don't claim that this is a perfect thought experiment. You're welcome to propose your own, but I'm interested to know your thoughts. What do you think you would do? What do you think is right? And what do you think is analogous to some of the real-world scenarios we've been discussing? I'll be very interested to follow what I hope is a lively and engaging discussion in the comments section below. I'd also really encourage you to watch the full interviews I had with Bernadette and Edward. They were very generous with their time and I thank them for that. They also have very detailed and nuanced views, I think, which are worth listening to. I'd also like to thank all the people that helped make this video possible. If you'd like to support me on Patreon to help make more of these kind of videos, please check the description box below. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, please take care of yourself. This is an extremely emotional and difficult topic to talk about. And I expect that for some of you, the topics I've talked about are not ones that you're unfamiliar with in your personal life. So please try to support each other in the comments. Please try not to be too mean. And if you or someone you know needs help, please check the resources in the description box below. Thank you and bye for now.